No one expected that beneath the gray layers of archival dust, on yellowed sheets of paper, there would appear the precise lines of future avenues, silent squares crowned with monuments, and a strict grid of districts designed for decades of peaceful life. Few could believe that the man known to the world as the chief architect of a totalitarian machine thought not only of monumental backdrops for parades and propaganda displays, but also of everyday routines of transport, sanitation, kindergartens, and hospitals in cities meant to rise after the war. The evidence, confirmed by plans, notes, and estimates, contradicted the familiar image, and that was why it provoked disbelief. The very idea of a long, peaceful future conceived in the midst of destruction sounded paradoxical. Yet the drawings lay before the researchers, every stroke precisely measured: the width of the main roads, the turning radius of trams, the density of housing, the orientation of courtyards according to the prevailing winds. This was not improvisation or fantasy, but a work of engineering discipline, supported by calculations and logic. The architectural handwriting revealed a craving for clarity, symmetry, and spatial discipline. In one of the volumes lay the general plan for the capital's transformation, a city of straight, taut boulevards intersecting at carefully chosen angles, built for parades and mass marches. Yet between those lines of grandeur, one could see quieter quarters, utility routes, and instructions for how streetlights should operate to save electricity on ordinary days. The radical scale of power display coexisted with a meticulous concern for logistics, for the mundane mechanisms of city life. The contrast forced reflection on how deeply ideology had penetrated the daily order of the urban environment, and how carefully that daily order was modeled to reinforce control. In another set of documents, researchers found plans for a port city on a cold northern coast, its docks curved to match the shape of the bay, its districts for officers and workers separated so that sea winds could sweep the streets clean of damp air. The project's annotations listed rainfall statistics, recommended warehouse locations, and included rail yard diagrams that calculated the exact turning distance for heavy trains. Such attention to detail confirmed that this was no symbolic gesture, but a genuine projection of a post-war period, one filled with routine, schedules, deliveries, and the bureaucratic rhythm of an ordered peace. Through those paper fields, one could trace the intention to control not only facades, but rhythms. The city was envisioned as a metronome, setting the pace for marching columns and bus timetables alike. Some drawings marked parks and recreation areas in watercolor washes, while others were covered in hard ink lines, showing warehouses, sorting stations, underground parking, and air shafts for civil defense shelters. Sparse pencil notes recorded standard materials and transportation methods, accounting for the seasonal availability of rivers. There was no spontaneity in this system. It was a vision of a stable, tightly governed world. Researchers noted the consistent logic of function. Residential quarters were designed near public centers, schools, clinics, and cultural halls. Food markets were placed at transit nodes to prevent delivery trucks from crossing commuter traffic at dawn. Regulations for nighttime lighting and noise levels were recorded. Streets in housing areas were narrower than parade boulevards, lined with double rows of trees to absorb dust and sound. A practice reminiscent of modern urban planning, yet subordinated to a geometry of authority. Even courtyards were shaped as observation nodes, so that no inner space escaped visibility. In this combination of pragmatism and ideological symmetry appeared a new kind of urbanism, where convenience served as the outer shell of discipline. Implementing such a project required resources the war consumed by the day. Yet the blueprints persisted, as if paper and ink could defy the logic of scarcity. The budgets included precise columns for granite, limestone, steel, concrete, elevators, and equipment. Appendices listed stages, First, the relocation of rail junctions. Then, the creation of the main axis. Then, construction of central halls and the reconstruction of nearby blocks. As the war worsened, the stages shifted on the timeline, but they were never erased, only postponed, like promises deferred indefinitely. Alongside the grand urban plans existed smaller projects, train stations, bridges, standardized streetlights, facade regulations. Schemes for underground lighting were accompanied by calculations of crowd density during peak hours, showing a concern for the everyday movement of people. Infrastructure was designed as a hierarchy, in which every bolt mattered as much as the monumental facade. That fusion of large-scale vision and micro-detail made the picture disturbingly coherent. It revealed not only the ambition of power, but also the cold rationality of an apparatus that sought to script urban life decades ahead. The deeper the researchers studied the documents, the clearer it became. These were plans not for wartime, but for a presumed peace. There were no references to ruins or provisional housing. Instead, the papers described solid neighborhoods, stable demographics, family growth projections, and maintenance cycles, replacement of pipes every 30 years, periodic renewal of tram fleets, statistics of water consumption in summer months. The authors imagined the future as a managed system where the calendar of holidays aligned with peaks of urban maintenance, where budgets followed predictable lines, where every district had its passport and lifespan. Yet the towers of that imagined order stood on a foundation that could never bear moral weight. The resource model embedded in the estimates relied on forced labor and a logistics network sustained by violence. That contradiction tore through the paper itself. The technical logic sought comfort and order for the privileged, while the political logic required coercion and deprivation. This fracture made the projects both precisely calculated and ethically impossible. They could have been built as stone and asphalt, but not justified as a human habitat meant to last. The academic perspective stripped away the myths of spontaneity and recognized in these blueprints a long strategic vision, an architecture of control meant to follow victory. The common claim that no one believed in post-war cities was therefore only partly true. There were those who sincerely imagined a transition from mobilization to normality, from wartime supply chains to the daily schedules of schools and trams. Paper preserved that hope, long after reality had erased it with smoke and ruins. In the end, it was on paper alone, in the drawings, the notes, the calculations that those post-war cities ever truly existed. And that is why, today, these documents read not as monuments to greatness, but as records of illusion, an illusion disciplined enough to reach the last line of its blueprints. We could not believe how far the vision had gone beyond the sketches of the capital. The archives revealed not a single project, but a network of future cities, each meant to serve a specific function in the projected empire of the new order. They were not fantasies of domes and columns alone. They were logistical organisms, ports, industrial districts, and administrative centers mapped to precise coordinates, linked by rail, and integrated into a continental system of supply. Each carried the mark of an architect who believed that power could be measured in cubic meters of stone and kilometers of straight road. The detail and foresight suggested that these cities were designed for permanence, not spectacle. The framework for a civilization meant to last forever. One plan, found in northern archives, described a coastal settlement named Nordstern, North Star. The name itself symbolized direction and endurance. The city was to rise near the fjords, its broad avenues facing the sea, its government buildings overlooking a harbor large enough for fleets and merchant convoys. The documents listed power stations, schools, hospitals, theaters, and shipyards. Even the foundations were calculated for cold climates, with drainage and ventilation systems designed decades ahead. The vision included the noise of daily life markets, trams, gardens, all drawn into a geometry that promised order. It was an architectural fiction of peace built on the logic of conquest. The irony lay in the timing. While bombs fell across Europe, blueprints for peace were inked in underground offices, illuminated by electric lamps shielded from air raids. Engineers, draftsmen, and surveyors continued their work using meteorological tables, soil analyses, and demographic forecasts that assumed stability. Reports described future settlers and the infrastructure that would sustain them. The language was administrative, stripped of emotion. Yet beneath it lived a faith that history could be managed through planning. Every railway and housing block was a line drawn against uncertainty. These post-war cities first existed in miniature precise models of plaster and wood. Photographs show them in exhibition halls, lit from above so that shadows matched the northern sun. Visitors walked among them, seeing a promised future. Clean streets, vast plazas, monumental halls. There were no ruins, shortages, or refugees. The models represented a world that had already forgotten the chaos of war. Civilization rebuilt not from memory, but from command. Historians studying these materials later noticed a broader pattern. The plans reflected a modernist faith, in control the belief that the future could be drawn on paper and built to scale. It was a symptom of a century, intoxicated by order and technology. What made these particular blueprints haunting was their context: destruction dressed as rebirth. The act of drawing cities while the old ones burned revealed a collective denial of collapse. Architecture was being used to compensate for the loss of meaning. Each perfect street was an argument against chaos. Within the plans lay impossibility. The population figures assumed endless prosperity. The resources ignored wartime depletion. The designs demanded obedience from nature and from people alike. They were utopias built on command. Yet the technical precision of the documents concealed the fragility of their premise. The imagined foundations rested on soil that would never bear such certainty. Nature itself was the silent opponent, waiting to reclaim the paper once the ink faded. After the war, fragments of these plans survived: rolled sheets, photographs, pieces of plaster models. Many were labeled simply urban reconstruction. For years, no one wanted to touch them. They were the residue of a dream too contaminated to revisit. Yet the technical beauty, the discipline of line, the balance of space drew attention from later architects. Some saw in them the last echo of total design, harmony at any cost. Others saw only a warning that order, pursued without conscience, becomes destruction itself. In later decades, the remnants entered museums and archives. Exhibitions displayed them behind glass with neutral captions about architectural history. Visitors studied them as curiosities, detached from the human cost behind their creation. Yet under the sterile lights, the maps retained their allure: harmonious proportions, perfect symmetry. For a moment, it was easy to forget their origin. The cities that never came continued to exist in imagination, silent, sterile, suspended in a future that never arrived. Their story is not only architectural, but moral. It shows how power tries to immortalize itself in stone, and how architecture, stripped of empathy, becomes a weapon of permanence. The drawings were not just designs, they were declarations of eternity, the belief that history could be frozen in geometry. That illusion, even in failure, left a trace. It remains in the language of planning, in the persistence of monumental scales that still shape the way cities are imagined today. The discovery of these documents changed a generation's understanding. It forced a confrontation with a paradox: that the dream of perfect order can coexist with the machinery of destruction. The cities that never came were not fantasies of peace, but blueprints of control. Their unrealized streets still haunt imagination because they represent something universal, the human desire to build certainty in a world that resists it. Though they were never constructed, they remain monuments, not of stone, but of the illusion that even in the darkest moments, someone was still drawing a future that could never exist. We did not expect that the legacy of those forgotten plans would outlive the regime that created them. Yet, decades after the war, the cities that never came continued to influence the way space was imagined, built, and governed. The architects and planners who studied the archives in later years found themselves caught between fascination and unease. What they uncovered was not merely a historical curiosity, but a mirror held up to the ambitions of every age, the desire to build permanence, to discipline the unpredictable, to replace the organic growth of cities with a rational grid. The blueprints had survived, and with them survived the question: how much control is too much? In post-war Europe, reconstruction became an urgent necessity. Entire districts lay in ruins, and planners turned instinctively toward order and clarity. Some of them had been trained under the same architectural doctrines that had inspired the monumental designs of the previous era. They now applied those lessons to peaceful ends, standardized housing, efficient transport, organized public spaces. Without acknowledging it, they carried fragments of the same logic that had once shaped the impossible cities. The difference was moral rather than technical. The tools of geometry remained, only their justification had changed. The dream of the perfect city proved too seductive to disappear entirely. Meanwhile, historians began piecing together the story behind the blueprints. They reconstructed timelines, correspondence, and internal reports to understand how so much effort had been devoted to a future that never arrived. The deeper they looked, the more they saw a portrait of obsession. The architects had drawn as though the war were already over, as though the ruins outside their windows did not exist. Their faith in planning had become a defense mechanism against chaos. The pencil replaced the weapon. The drawing board replaced the battlefield. In those precise lines lay an attempt to make sense of destruction by denying it. The result was both tragic and profoundly human, a demonstration of how easily the will to build can turn into the refusal to see. Over time, the surviving documents entered museums, archives, and academic collections. They were studied by students of architecture, urbanism, and political history. Exhibitions traveled from Berlin to Oslo, from London to New York, displaying the models of unrealized cities under soft white lights. Visitors moved quietly, as if walking through ghost streets. Captions described materials, scales, and dimensions. But behind the technical data lingered something deeper, a tension between vision and consequence. For some, these displays were warnings. For others, they were testaments to the power of imagination, unrestrained by reality. The line between admiration and discomfort blurred, just as it had when the plans were first drawn. Even outside museums, the influence of that architecture could still be felt. The monumental boulevards of modern capitals, the symmetry of government districts, the wide, empty plazas designed for public gatherings, all carried faint echoes of the same ambition. Not in ideology, but in form. The 20th century had inherited the idea that power should express itself through space. The unfinished cities of the past thus lived on as blueprints of mentality, shaping the spatial language of modern governance. Every time a planner traced a grid across a landscape, every time a city sought to impose order on complexity, a shadow of those lost designs flickered at the edge of memory. For the researchers who cataloged the documents, the greatest shock came not from the scale of the projects, but from their sincerity. The architects had truly believed they were building for a better world, one cleansed of disorder and uncertainty. They saw themselves as rationalists, not ideologues, convinced that structure itself could heal society. That conviction outlasted the system that birthed it. In the post-war decades, similar sentiments reappeared in new forms. The modernist housing bloc, the regulated suburb, the administrative capital built from scratch. The belief in total planning proved resilient, even as history tried to discredit it. Yet the blueprints also preserved a quieter message. They reminded later generations of the fragility of human intention, of how easily a line drawn for beauty can serve the machinery of control. The same geometry that creates harmony can also enforce conformity. The same vision that seeks clarity can erase individuality. Each rediscovered plan became a moral lesson disguised as a technical artifact. The more precisely the old architects had drawn their cities, the clearer this paradox became. Their perfection was their failure. Today, the surviving fragments are kept in climate-controlled rooms, their paper stabilized, their ink protected from fading. Researchers continue to digitize them, translating the language of an empire that never existed into data for the modern age. On screens, the streets reappear straight, wide, meticulously labeled. They exist in virtual space as they never did in physical form. In a way, technology has finally built them, not in stone, but in pixels. And there, in their silent precision, they still evoke the same uneasy admiration. The cities that never came now live as digital ghosts, cleaner, safer, and far less human than any real city could ever be. What remains, above all, is the paradox. The blueprints reveal both the brilliance of human design and its blindness. They remind us that architecture is never neutral, that every wall and boulevard carries an intention. The men who drew those plans sought eternity and achieved only memory. Yet their work endures as a caution that the line between planning for peace and planning for control is as thin as a stroke of ink. The dust has long settled. The regime that ordered those cities is gone. But the questions raised by their existence still stand. How do we balance order and freedom? How do we build without erasing? How do we draw the future without repeating the mistakes of the past? The cities never built have become metaphors for the human condition, our endless attempt to shape chaos into meaning, to impose structure on what refuses to stay still. In that sense, the story never truly ends. The blueprints remain, quietly reminding us that the desire to create a perfect world can be as dangerous as the will to destroy one. And somewhere, in the stillness of an archive drawer, under sheets of protective glass, the dust on the blueprints continues to whisper of a future that was never meant to be.